Section 14.3, measuring pressure. So how do we actually measure pressure? Well, mercury barometers are the classic way. And here's a very simple version of one, where we have a tube full of mercury, which is very, very dense, and then we just flip it over into a container so that what's left above is a pressure of approximately 0, right? There's maybe some mercury vapors there, but it's mostly a vacuum, and then it fills up to some point, and the height difference between the top of that mercury level at level 2 and the place where the mercury is open to the air, that H can allow us to measure the atmospheric pressure, right? So using our previous equations that we got for a static fluid, once this is all static, and noting that the pressure here is 0, well, down below, the pressure that we now want to measure, P0, we're trying to measure atmospheric pressure, is just equal to the density of mercury times g, acceleration due to gravity, times the height of that mercury column. And this is where that millimeters of mercury, millimeter mm of Hg, comes into play, because that was the classic way to measure pressure, was to say, hey, how tall is that mercury column? Because if there is a higher atmospheric pressure, that's going to push that column up to greater and greater heights. And this is the simple version, but the only thing that actually matters here is the height, not the cross-sectional area. So we could have a much more complicated arrangement that has all these other side tubes, and still the only thing that we're measuring is the difference in height between where the mercury encounters the air and the top level of the mercury. So here's one example with mercury barometers. Now note, the height of the mercury column is only numerically equal to torr if the barometer is at a place where G has its standard value of 9.8, so might be a little different if we go on to Mount Everest, as well as if the temperature of the mercury is 0 degrees Celsius. So freezing temperature, it won't be frozen, but it's not going to work if you're in the tropics. Right, another type of pressure measuring device is, here's an open tube manometer. So we have a tank with some fluid in it, like gas, and there's some pressure of that gas, and then it's connected to this tube that has a fluid in between on this U-shaped tube, and it's open to the atmosphere. So the fluid is free to rise on the right or rise on the left. It can shift its relative amount in each. And what we measure is the height difference between the two sides of the U, right? And by measuring that height difference, we can get the gauge pressure. We can get the pressure that's absolutely inside the tank relative to the atmosphere, because the difference between those will just be our rho GH. So this goes back to our definition of gauge pressure, and it's where the idea of gauge pressure comes from, because it's what gauges tell you. It gives you the difference in pressure relative to atmospheric pressure, because a lot of times we have to have some sort of reference value. Note the gauge pressure can be positive or negative depending on whether the pressure being measured is greater or less than atmospheric pressure. So if you get a positive gauge pressure, you're measuring something that's at a pressure above atmospheric. But if you get a negative gauge pressure, that just means it's something that has less pressure than atmospheric pressure. And a great example of gauge pressure is actually your car tires or your bicycle tires. So car tires are recommended to be inflated to something like 35 psi. That's not the absolute pressure. That is what your pressure gauge will measure if you stick your pressure gauge on there. And that's because it's giving you the pressure above atmospheric pressure. Atmospheric pressure is only about 15 psi. And so 30 psi wouldn't be that much more than it. Wouldn't be enough to support your car. But instead, you're supposed to inflate it to 30 psi plus that 15. So an absolute pressure of 45 psi. And that is now enough to be able to support the entire car, which is quite weighty. So there's an example of gauge pressure in practice, as well as how we go about measuring pressure.